From the very beginning, this series has been driven by two simple questions. Who were Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man, and what chain of events led to their deaths? Following these questions has taken us out into the landscape itself, to Croghan Hill in County Offaly, to Lough Crew and the Hill of Tara in County Meath. These weren't just backdrops to Iron Age life, but places people actively returned to, gathered at, and invested with meaning. In the Iron Age, sites like these acted as anchors for belief and authority. They were where ritual met power, where communities came together, and where the relationship between people, land, and even the supernatural was continually reinforced. At each location, we uncovered pieces of the puzzle, insights that help us understand the beliefs, practices, and social structures that shaped the world Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man lived in. And now it's time to step back and look at what we've uncovered so far. Rather than searching for a single, neat answer, we're asking what the evidence allows us to understand and what it suggests about why these men were chosen, how they died, and what their deaths may have meant to the people who placed them in the bog. This is where all the threads come together. Welcome to the final episode of the Discovery series, The Bog Bodies. I'm Fionn Davenport, and today we're going to try to weave those threads into an answer to the central question of the series. What really happened to Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man? Across the series, we've heard from historians, archaeologists and scientists in Ireland and beyond, people who have dedicated years to unravelling this mystery. At the end of our conversations, I asked them all the same question. Based on everything we know, the science, the ritual context, the wounds, the locations, what do they think happened to these two men? The theories broadly fall into three groups, and we'll hear each of them. But to help make sense of it all, I'm joined by Anthony Murphy, author and curator of Mythical Ireland. He's written 10 books exploring the deep past of this island, and in 2018 even made a major discovery of his own, a previously unknown henge in the Boyne Valley. So, let's get into it. The first theory comes from Dr. Rena Maguire, who we met back in episode 2.
I suspect that Baby did a bad thing, but it was also very convenient that they could dispatch them. It was a win-win situation for whoever were the murderers. I'm afraid I have to call them what they were. Whether they had been rival tribes, whether they had been people who had maybe done something dreadful, murderers, rapists, who knows, or prisoners of war. It was convenient to pop them off as both a sacrifice and presumably be able to tell prophecy from how they were dying, and also you were making sure they weren't coming back. And incidentally, that's something, especially with burials in the Iron Age, they don't really want their dead very close to them at all. With these two particular blokes, they don't want them to rest anywhere, God help them. They don't want them to go to wherever you go after, and they don't want them back.
I mean, that feels savage to me. Like, if indeed, Rena, if she's accurate, the idea of burying them in the bog, a place where the dead don't move on, they can't access the other world. And also it feels like this is the permanent punishment for whatever crime you committed in life. You are going to stay away from the living forever, but equally you're never going to find peace in the afterlife either.
Sounds like purgatory, doesn't it?
Yes.
It sounds like judgment, judgment and something akin to the lake of fire, It actually sounds a little bit like a Christian idea. However, something that's very important to consider about what we know from the written records of the first millennium AD in particular. And I always say that the written history of that millennium, a lot of the traditions of that, which are viewed by Christianity as being thoroughly pagan and dark and all the rest, that they stem from much older times. My assumption is always that if you see something in the time of St. Patrick relating to the kings or whatever, that has a long history, a long gestation. The provenance of that belongs deep in prehistory, in the unwritten, unrecorded period. But let's acknowledge something here about that first millennium AD. It's bloody mayhem. Medieval society is blood and guts and gore. And this internecine warfare between the rival kings and expansion of kingdoms and the various septs and later dynasties like the O'Neills, sparing no quarter So was it a case that the Bog Bodies represent kings who were killed by rival kings? That is still a possibility.
So, according to Rena, their deaths may have served two purposes: punishment for a serious transgression and a convenient opportunity for sacrifice. This wasn't a noble offering to the gods or the land, but something more pragmatic. Someone wanted them gone and used the belief system of the time to make sure they never returned. Anthony thinks this theory holds some water, particularly when you consider just how violent the Iron Age was. This was a world where power shifted quickly, rival groups clashed constantly, and justice could be swift and brutal. It's fair to say, though, that Rena's is something of an outlier theory. Noel French, who we met in episode 1 in Believer, where Clonycavan Man was discovered, thinks these were ritual killings, deliberate acts carried out with meaning and ceremony. But he also thinks where they were placed was hugely significant.
Territory was important, and there is a suggestion again that these bog bodies have been deposited on borders. They could be protecting a border area, as in, we're a community here, we're burying our leader here. You're not going to come near us because that is a sacred place. So that is one concept. The other thing fascinating about these bog bodies is, why were they sacrificed? And they were sacrificed because they were very brutal events. Clonycavan Man gets 3 blows to the head. It's not with a sword or an axe, something sharp. It's something that's almost blunt. So if they were being kind to him and wanted to do it quickly for him, they would have used something sharp and done it quickly. And bogs are places of water. They're sort of near neither solid ground nor lakes, but they're about 90% water. Was it a sort of limbo in which they could not go on to the next life and they were stuck in this life? Was that part of the sacrifice? And it looks as if he willingly knelt before them, because there are no wounds, defence wounds. Occasionally in some bog bodies there may be a defence wound, but in the vast majority of them there's no wounds to show that they weren't prepared for this. I think he willingly went to his death for the greater good, in the hopes of giving his people a better life.
I mean, that's an interesting theory. The idea somehow that the deaths of old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man were voluntary acts for the greater good, and that burying them on territorial borders, that this bog, this half land, half water space that kind of held them in a spiritual limbo, but deliberately so that their sacrifice protects the community. What are your thoughts on that one?
The thing of territory is fascinating, because territory was, of course, as the centuries progressed, there were more entitlements to territory, due to the septs and their families and descendants. And, that became a major problem. The idea of liminality is indeed fascinating. Bogs are not typically inhabitable spaces, They are those zones lying between spaces, as it were, bordering territories. And I think old Croghan Man, he was found quite close to the border between two tribal territories. So Noel has a point there, but are they being buried or are they being displayed? Because if you're burying them, they're hidden from view. That doesn't send a message, really. But if you're displaying them somehow post-mortem, that certainly would send a message. We have, in mythological tradition, we have the notion of the king must be perfect. And we have the Banashri, the wedding feast of the king. The king must be married to the land. But again, we're not told in detail what happens to that king when that relationship is seen to break down. And it breaks down on two sides. Either something happens to the king, he becomes sick, or he gets injured in battle and he's then no longer perfect. Or there's something wrong with the land, the crops failing, the cattle are dying of disease, or, there's a drought, a prolonged drought affecting the crops or whatever. You took on kingship knowing full well that at some point, whether you've transgressed or not, something's going to catch up on you. The relationship with the goddess goes sour, and you can be not just dispatched, but dispatched in a particularly gory and gruesome way.
Okay, so there are a couple of possibilities to think about here. It's possible that Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man were ritually killed, but that doesn't automatically mean they were being punished for a crime. In some Iron Age societies, a leader who became old, weakened or unwell might no longer have been seen as capable of fulfilling their role. Their death, however stark it seems to us, could be understood as a necessary act to restore balance and continuity within the community. There is also a harsher interpretation. Leaders carried responsibility for the well-being of their people. If crops failed, illness spread, or a run of bad fortune took hold, then responsibility could turn into blame. When a society believed its survival depended on order being maintained, the consequences of failure could be extreme. Which brings us to one of the most compelling interpretations, that Old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man held positions of exceptional status. Not kings in the modern sense, but figures whose authority were bound up in ritual, belief and obligation. Their role demanded prosperity and stability, and when that broke down, they may have been seen as having broken something far deeper. Under this view, death was not enough. The body itself had to be carefully and deliberately altered, stripping away the markers of power and preventing any return to that role in the next world. It was a final symbolic act, decisive, permanent and public. This interpretation is put forward by Eamon Kelly, former Keeper of Antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland.
These are ritual killings. We know that the victims were stunned, were knocked unconscious before the rest of the injuries were inflicted on the bodies. I think there's two aspects of it. We see Old Croghan Man being divided into parts of the body that retain different and important aspects of the personality of a sacral king. So clearly they're decommissioning that king in inflicting those particular injuries. They certainly don't seem to have been restrained. In the case of Old Croghan Man, his hands were free when he was stabbed through the heart. And we know that because he raised his left arm to ward off a sword that was coming to stab him in the heart. We also know that subsequent to that, there were holes drilled in his arm, and a spancel, which is a cattle hobble made of twisted twigs, widdies, were inserted into his arms. And again, this is an object that has a lot of ritual connotations in ancient Ireland. A hobble is something you use to protect your cattle from being run off in cattle raids, but you also use them to hobble the cattle for milking. So it's associated with milk production. And in early Irish law, if you were laying claim to something, if something was under claim, the start of the legal process was the placing of a spancel on the object. Again, that also indicates that these things were done to him after he was dead, because he certainly would have been able to raise his arm to ward off the sword blade if they drilled holes in his arms. So we get a sense that what's going on is done in sequence and is following ritual practices.
I mean, it's an established theory, particularly, say, with Old Croghan Man, where the injuries line up with symbols of kingship, fertility, milk production, territorial control, and all of these encoded into the violence. So it's not psychotic frenzy, it's not murder, it's very ritualized. There's structure, there's purpose, there's meaning behind it all.
Yeah, and that further implies that he knew what was coming. You know, the idea that the king should be wedded to the land, and the land is his consort or his partner in life, is basically his marriage partner in a way, his sacred marriage partner, and the land is always represented by the female deity, the queen, the great queen, as it were. We know that that's the case, but what we don't know is what happens when the marriage breaks down, you know. What are the details of the divorce settlement, you know. And unfortunately, in many cases, the king was for the chop, so to speak. Dismemberment is an interesting thing because, there are dismemberment origin myths. I mean, all around the world. We have one in the Boyne Valley, Bowen, the goddess. There's dismemberment before or during the act of creation. It's almost as if it was a prerequisite for the rebirth, the rejuvenation of the cosmos.
Explain that to me.
Well, Bowen, was deformed in the formation of the Boyne River. She lost her eye and her arm and her leg, and bits of her body basically form parts of the nascent Boyne landscape. And we've a similar story then about a monster, the Mata, that was hacked to pieces at Newgrange and thrown into the Boyne. And did you know that the Dublin's Irish name comes from a Boyne Valley myth? Clea, the ford of the hurdles, was supposed to be in the rib cage of this monster that was dismembered at Newgrange, thrown into the Boyne and floated out into the sea and along the Boyne, or along the coast of the sea and down into the Liffey. So if you've got somebody who is ritually being dismembered, it doesn't necessarily imply automatically that that's ritual, but it certainly leans towards it. So there's something about this definitely that would make me lean towards the ritual thing, more so than the idea of sort of sin and punishment, or, sin and purgatory.
When we started this journey, we sought to find answers to a bunch of key questions. Who were O'Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man? What kind of lives did they live? Were they men of importance? And most crucially, what happened to them? Like, why were they killed so brutally? It seems that all of the experts, including yourself, lean towards the ritual, the sense that this was a ritualized form of killing, that there was structure and order to it. But there are a number of unanswerable, not just unanswered, but unanswerable questions. In part because things weren't written down, in part because of preservation. But we do have this amazing landscape of possibilities, like, failed kings, noble volunteers, taboo individuals, cast forever into the bog. Is that enough?
Always, 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 in asking a question of the past, if you try to answer that question, you will naturally lead to further questions. It is precisely because it's mysterious that people are fascinated by it. It's precisely because there are so many possibilities.
As much as this journey has been a search for answers, one of the unexpected consequences has been a greater embrace of the mystery of not knowing that Anthony is talking about. If history is about studying established facts to generate theories of understanding, then prehistory is about learning to sit with uncertainty, reading fragments rather than records, patterns rather than proofs, and accepting that some truths resist being fully recovered. It leaves space for interpretation, not as guesswork, but as a way to stretch our imaginations, test ideas, and even explore what those fragments of evidence might still be trying to tell us. When I climbed Croghan Hill with Amanda Pedlow in episode 1, I was particularly struck by the stone sculpture at the top, a four-sided plinth where each side is carved with stories connected to the hill. One face shows the eruption that formed Croghan Hill, reminding us that this landmark began as an ancient volcano 350 million years ago. Another panel tells the story of how St. Bridget received her veil there. Another panel depicts the legend of St. Patrick's horse, who kicked a rock on the hill from which sprouted a holy well. And then the final face honours the nearby discovery of Old Croghan Man. Each representation encourages us to imagine our own version of each story, which I guess is one of the purposes of art. But the piece is also a reminder that the stories of this landscape aren't just behind museum glass. They live out here too, in the wind, in the earth, and in the people who continue to honour them. A few days after that climb, I sat down with Ciaran Byrne, the stone carver who designed and crafted the sculpture. He told me there's no better way to honour Ireland's ancient past and to protect its stories for the future than by setting them in a material that has stood here longer than any memory.
Stone is all about stories, especially in the history of Ireland. Going back to the scripture crosses from the monastic period, like the stone cross was there as a thing to gather around and share the stories. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my work is to provide pieces of work in the landscape that are a kind of a focal point in the landscape and a thing for people to gather around and to share stories. I've always been fascinated by the Bog Bodies, and I've visited them quite a lot in the National Museum. And I've always been fascinated by old Croghan Man's hands and, how pristine his fingernails are. I just love the idea of connecting with something that's that ancient. And by doing something like putting up a piece of stonework, you're making a connection with the future, because, even though we think stone carving is a kind of an old-fashioned thing, like it's been around for a long time, but when you make a thing in stone, you're casting that piece and that message, way into the future, way beyond your own life expectancy. And so stone is all about that coming together of different times, the time that we're at, the time of the future, and then trying to pull together, almost like the middle of the hourglass, trying to pull together enough stories to then sort of cast them on into the future.
As you're standing at the top of the mountain with the wind blowing and you can see the Bog of Allen kind of stretched out before you, maybe my imagination helped me kind of get a sense this is the world in which he lived and then died. And then talking to Noel French, and Noel talked a lot about sitting with the Bog Bodies and just listening to them. Not for words, obviously, but for something else, for some kind of truth about them. So I've come back to the National Museum of Ireland to do just that, to sit with old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man and try and get a sense of what Noel was talking about. And they're kept in these sanctuaries, in these walls that protect them, that give them dignity, that give them privacy. Because, of course, their museum exhibits. There's labels and lighting and temperature controls. But they're not a piece of pottery. They're not an artifact. They're not some beautiful silver brooch that was found. They're people. They're remains of human beings. And that's the thing that really jumps out at me. And I've come to the National Museum hundreds of times over the years. But I think this could be the first time that I'm actually sitting with them and I can get a sense of old Croghan Man as a man and Clonycavan Man as a man. And I've tried to imagine the life that they lived, and I've tried to imagine the things they cared about, and I've tried to imagine how they felt about the world in which they lived and the sacrifices they made and the terrible death that they both suffered. And all the while, you're sitting here and your voice gets lower and you feel the sense of quietness come over you, because that's what they deserve. These were men, and even though 2,000 years separates me from them, I think more than anything else, I get a sense that these were guys who lived, and, they lived rich lives, but also died terrible deaths. A few days have passed since I sat with old Croghan Man and Clonycavan Man, giving me space to reflect on the journey that I've taken. I've learnt an awful lot about them and the world they lived in, but still parts of it remain shrouded in mystery. Yes, 2,500 years is a long time ago, but not so long that its echoes are completely gone. Their bodies alone tell us plenty. They were high-status men, well cared for and closely connected through trade. Their deaths were no accident. They were deliberate, layered with meaning. The injuries suggest ritual, an act rooted in belief and power. Now, the precise reason for their deaths may remain a mystery, yet what they've given us is nothing short of remarkable, a thread that ties us back to the people who shaped this island long before our names were written in any record. They show us that Ireland's ancient past isn't a chapter closed. It breathes beneath the soil, is woven into the places we think we already know. It's alive on the summit of Croghan Hill, where kings once pledged themselves to the land. It waits on the hill of Tara, at the very heart of sovereignty and myth. And it glows in the cairns of Lough Crew, where the equinox sun slips through the stone to meet the darkness inside. But you'll also find it at Rathgall Stone Fort in County Carlow, the stronghold of Celtic royalty, and on the Corley Trackway in Longford, a timber road laid carefully across a bog more than 2 millennia ago that still carries the echoes of the footsteps that crossed it. And you'll see it at the National Museum in Dublin, behind glass and low light, where the Kingship Sacrifice exhibit keeps its vigil. There, the preserved remains of old Croghan man and Clonycavan man watch silently, reminding us that while the answers may be buried, the story of who they were and why they died is still rising to the surface. Go to these places and listen to what the past has to say. The Discovery series, The Bog Bodies, is a podcast made exclusively for Discover Ireland. Ireland is rich in ancient sites, places you can visit, walk through and experience for yourself. So, why not turn curiosity into a short break, get out into the landscape that shaped these stories and explore what still lingers there today? To start planning, visit discoverireland.ie.